Zalika's days had always been marked by the rhythmic struggles of village life, her hands worn from labor, yet her heart light with the warmth of family. The scent of damp earth filled the air after the morning rain as she helped her mother grind millet, their laughter a fragile joy in the face of hardship. But beneath this simple life, a storm had long been brewing. Her father, Omari, was once a respected trader, but misfortune shadowed his steps. A series of failed ventures left him drowning in debt to Chief Jabari, the most powerful man in the region. Jabari was feared and revered in equal measure, a man whose wealth was matched only by his appetite for control. He collected debts not just in gold, but in land, labor, and sometimes, lives. One evening, under the glow of flickering oil lamps, Omari sat in his hut, hands trembling as he counted the meager coins he had scraped together. The sum was pitiful, not even close to what he owed. His wife, Amina, watched with hollow eyes, knowing the chief would soon come to collect. The entire village knew what happened to those who failed him. As the night deepened, footsteps echoed outside their home. Zalika's heart pounded as 3 of the chief's men entered, their faces carved with indifference. They did not speak at first, letting the weight of their presence settle like a stone. "The chief is generous," one finally said, his voice laced with something cold and final. "He offers you a choice, Omari." Zalika turned to her father, her breath held as he straightened his back, trying to summon dignity from his broken form. "The land," the man continued, "or something of equal value." A silence fell so thick it suffocated. Amina gripped Zalika's wrist, her nails digging into her skin. "We have nothing left," Omari whispered, his voice cracking. The man's gaze slid to Zalika, standing in the dim light, her wide eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. A slow smile curled at his lips. "The chief has an eye for beauty," he said. "Your daughter will do." Amina gasped, stumbling forward, shielding Zalika with her arms. "No! You cannot." Omari stood frozen, his face drained of color. He knew what refusal meant. He had seen what happened to those who defied Jabari. The beatings, the disappearances, the silent graves beyond the river. Zalika's stomach twisted as she saw the resignation seep into her father's posture. "She is my daughter," he whispered. "And she will be well taken care of," the man assured, though there was no kindness in his tone. "The chief will be pleased, and your debt will be forgiven." Zalika stepped back, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She turned to her father, her voice breaking. "Baba, please." His eyes, wet with unshed tears, would not meet hers. Amina screamed, clawing at the men as they seized Zalika's arm, dragging her forward. "She is just a girl. Take me instead." But the men did not listen. Zalika fought, her body thrashing as the world blurred around her. The last thing she saw before being pulled into the night was her mother collapsing to her knees, sobs racking her body, and her father standing motionless, his face carved in silent agony. The cold air bit at her skin as she was pulled through the village, past huts where families lay asleep, unaware of the tragedy unfolding. Her feet stumbled on the uneven ground, but the grip on her arms was unyielding. By the time they reached the chief's compound, her strength had drained, leaving only hollow terror. The grand hut loomed before her, its entrance flanked by torches that burned too brightly, casting shadows that seemed to swallow her whole. As the doors swung open, Zalika was pushed inside, the scent of incense thick in the air. She collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. A deep voice rumbled from the darkness. "You belong to me now." Tears slid down Zalika's cheeks, but she did not look up. She already knew there was no escape. The night air was thick with the scent of burning wood and incense as Zalika was led through the grand compound. Her feet dragged against the packed earth, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs that followed her. Women in elaborate garments stood in the shadows of the chief's court, their faces half-lit by flickering torches. Some whispered behind their hands, their eyes sharp with curiosity, while others watched her with quiet pity. "She is the new one of them murmured. "She won't last long," another replied with a smirk. Zalika clenched her fists, her breath uneven as the guards pushed her forward. She had no idea what awaited her inside, but she refused to be swallowed by fear. Her father may have surrendered her, but she would not surrender herself. The entrance to the chief's hut loomed before her, grander than any home she had ever seen. Its high ceiling was held up by thick wooden beams, and rich animal hides covered the floor. The scent of spices and musk clung to the air, intoxicating yet suffocating. Golden lamps lined the walls, casting a warm glow over the intricate carvings that depicted scenes of conquest and power. The guards pushed her forward, and she stumbled onto the soft rugs beneath her feet. A deep chuckle echoed through the room. "So, this is Omari's daughter." Zalika's eyes snapped up, meeting the piercing gaze of Chief Jabari. He stood at the far end of the room, his broad chest bare, adorned with heavy gold necklaces. His arms, marked with scars of battle, rested at his sides in an air of complete dominance. He was taller than she had imagined, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood turn cold. She swallowed hard but did not look away. The chief stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "Do you understand why you are here?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Zalika forced herself to stand straighter, despite the trembling in her limbs. "I know my father was in debt," she said, her voice steady. "I know he chose to give me to you." A flicker of amusement crossed the chief's face. "Not many would dare speak so plainly in my presence." "I am not like the others," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. Jabari's expression darkened, though his lips curled into something dangerously close to a smile. "No, you are not." The women who had followed her inside let out soft gasps at her defiance, but Zalika ignored them. She would not lower herself to a mere possession, no matter what had been decided for her. "You belong to me now," Jabari said, stepping even closer. "Your father made his choice, and so you will obey." Zalika's nails dug into her palms. "I am not a slave." The room fell silent. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jabari tilted his head, studying her. Most women in her position would have fallen to their knees, pleading for mercy, but not Zalika. "And what do you think you are, then?" he asked. "A person," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm. "Not something to be owned." Jabari exhaled a slow breath, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker behind his cold eyes, interest, perhaps even admiration. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again. "You are brave," he admitted. "But bravery does not change reality." Zalika bit her lip to keep from shaking. She expected him to lash out, to strike her, to remind her of her place. Instead, he took a step back, a smirk playing on his lips. "Very well," he said. "I have no need for a broken doll. If you wish to fight, fight. But know this, Zalika," he leaned in slightly, his voice a low warning. "You will be mine, one way or another." With that, he turned away, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Take her to the women's quarters," he ordered. "She will learn in time." Two attendants stepped forward, gently but firmly guiding her away. Zalika's heart pounded as she was led deeper into the chief's compound, but one thought burned in her mind. She may have been given away, but she would not be conquered easily. The days in the chief's domain passed like a slow-burning fire, simmering with tension. Zalika refused to bow, and Chief Jabari refused to let her go. She was given a place among the chief's wives, though she was not one of them. The women adorned in silks and gold regarded her with disdain. They whispered when she passed, their laughter sharp as thorns. Naima, the chief's first wife, was the worst of them. "She thinks she is better than us," Naima sneered one evening, her jeweled fingers tightening around her cup of palm wine. "She is nothing but a farmer's daughter, yet she acts as if she belongs here." Zalika ignored her, as she ignored them all. She had no desire to fit into this world. The food was rich, the fabric soft, the beds luxurious, but none of it was freedom. Jabari watched her with unreadable eyes. He was a man used to obedience, to submission. When he spoke, others listened. When he commanded, they obeyed. But Zalika was different. She met his gaze without fear. She refused his gifts, a golden bracelet, a finely woven dress, a dish prepared with the rarest spices. She would not be bought. One night, as she sat alone by the fire, he approached her. "You reject my kindness," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with warning. Zalika did not look at him. Kindness should be freely given, not used as a chain. Jabari chuckled, the sound deep and amused. "You mistake generosity for chains?" She finally turned to him, her dark eyes burning with defiance. "What would you call it, then?" A long silence stretched between them, thick with something neither could name. "Do you know what I do to those who resist me?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Zalika swallowed, but she did not break. "I imagine you take what you want." Jabari smirked. "I could. But where's the pleasure in a battle already won?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. "You are a challenge, Zalika." She stiffened. "And you are a tyrant." His laughter was low and knowing. "Perhaps." Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her heart hammering in her chest. But not all battles in the chief's domain were fought with words. Naima, fueled by jealousy, had made her decision. If Zalika would not submit, she would suffer. Late one night, as Zalika lay awake, the shadows around her flickered. Before she could react, a heavy weight crashed onto her, hands pressing against her mouth. "You think you are special," a voice hissed in her ear. "You are nothing." Zalika thrashed, her nails clawing, her heart racing. The attack was swift and brutal, but she fought like a cornered animal. And then, the door slammed open. Jabari stood there, his expression carved from stone. The attackers scattered like frightened birds, but Naima did not run fast enough. The chief's hand closed around her wrist, and she gasped. His voice was quiet. "Dangerous. Did you think I would not know?" Naima trembled. "She disrespects you." "She..." Jabari's grip tightened, and she whimpered. "She is mine," he said simply. Zalika's breath caught. "Not she is under my rule. Not she is a guest. Mine." And for the first time, she realized. The battle between them was far from over. The night was alive with music, the rhythm of the drums echoing through the village like a heartbeat. Flames crackled in the great fire pit, casting golden light on the dancers who moved with the wild, untamed spirit of their ancestors. For a moment, Zalika allowed herself to forget. She let the music guide her, let her body remember what it was like to be free. Her hips swayed, her feet moved with the beat, and her arms lifted to the sky as though she were calling upon the spirits of old. Laughter rang around her, villagers spinning in circles, clapping to the rhythm. This was life. This was what had been stolen from her. And then, she felt it. A gaze. Heavy. Intense. Burning. Her movements faltered, the spell of the music breaking as her eyes met his. Chief Jabari stood at the edge of the gathering, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was not celebrating. He was not drinking or laughing. He was watching her. His stare was unlike the others. There was no mockery, no scorn. It was something deeper, something darker. Possessive. Curious. Her heart pounded as she turned away, willing herself to ignore him. But she couldn't. His presence was suffocating, invading her senses even from across the fire. And then, suddenly, he moved. One moment he was watching, the next he was walking, toward her. The crowd parted for him instinctively. The music slowed, voices hushed. The chief never sought out a woman. Women were given to him, offered willingly, desperate for his favor. But now, he was moving with purpose, his eyes locked onto the one woman who had never wanted him. Zalika's breath hitched as he reached her, standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Dance," he commanded, his voice low, meant only for her. She clenched her fists. "I was." "Then why did you stop?" Because of you, she wanted to say. Instead, she turned away, forcing herself to move again, to let the music reclaim her body. But this time, it was different. She felt him. He didn't touch her, but it was as if his presence alone had wrapped around her, guiding her movements, controlling her without a single word. Every sway of her hips, every turn of her body, she knew he was watching. The heat between them thickened. And then, his hand caught her wrist. The touch was gentle but firm, a warning and a promise all at once. She froze. The firelight flickered between them, their breaths uneven. Jabari's fingers slid lower, tracing the soft skin of her palm. It was not the touch of a conqueror. It was something else. Something she didn't understand. You defy me at every turn, he murmured. And yet, I see it in your eyes. She swallowed hard. See what? His grip tightened slightly. The way you feel me, even when you do not want to. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to spit in his face and walk away. But her body betrayed her. The air between them crackled, unspoken truths lingering in the silence. I have never had to chase something I wanted, he admitted, his voice raw, almost frustrated. Zalika exhaled shakily. And I have never been someone's thing to be chased. His jaw clenched. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, hesitation. Vulnerability? Whatever it was, it disappeared too quickly. He let go of her hand, stepping back as if releasing himself from some invisible chain. This is not over, he said simply. Zalika did not know if he meant the conversation, or whatever was brewing between them. As he walked away, leaving her standing in the center of the firelit circle, one terrifying thought consumed her. She was no longer just fighting against him. She was fighting against herself. The night was unnaturally silent. No whispers from the wind, no distant echoes of the village. Zalika lay restless on the soft furs of her sleeping mat, staring at the flickering candlelight that barely pushed back the darkness. Something felt wrong. Then, shuffling. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. Rough arms pulled her from the mat, and her feet barely touched the ground before she was being dragged out of the chief's hut. Her heart pounded wildly as she thrashed, kicking at her captors, but they were too strong. A hushed voice whispered in her ear. Be quiet if you want to live. Zalika froze. She recognized the voice, Naima. A sick feeling crawled into her stomach. This was no rescue. A shadowed figure loomed before her, a man she did not recognize. His features were sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. The chief will learn his place, he muttered before signaling for the warriors around him to move. Zalika barely had time to take a breath before she was thrown over a horse, the wind slamming against her face as they rode into the night. The journey was long and brutal. By the time they reached their destination, Zalika's body ached from the rough treatment. She was shoved into a large hut, its air thick with the stench of sweat and blood. She didn't need to be told who he was. Bakari, the warlord who had long hated Jabari, sat on a throne of polished bone and animal hide, his muscular frame draped in heavy beads. His grin sent shivers down her spine. You are smaller than I imagined, he mused, circling her like a predator. But I see why he keeps you. Zalika lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I am not something to be kept. His laughter was cruel. Oh, but you are. And now, you are mine. Her stomach twisted. She would rather die than be his prisoner. Back at the village, chaos erupted when Jabari stormed into the hut, demanding answers. The moment he realized Zalika was missing, his blood ran cold. Naima, standing in the shadows, smirked. Perhaps you should not have been so distracted by her. Jabari's rage was instant. He grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. Where is she? Naima's confidence wavered for the first time. I do not know. But the chief saw the lie in her eyes. He threw her aside and barked an order. Within moments, scouts were sent, and warriors prepared for battle. Jabari had conquered many things, but nothing had ever filled his chest with fire the way this did. He would raise everything to the ground if it meant getting her back. The attack came at dawn. Bakery's warriors were skilled, but Jabari's were ruthless. The air was thick with war cries, metal clashing against bone, the sickening scent of blood soaking the earth. Zalika heard the screams from inside her hut. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Then, the flap of the hut was torn open. Jabari stood there, his body slick with sweat and battle, his gaze burning. Zalika exhaled sharply, not knowing if it was relief or something far more dangerous. "You came for me," she whispered. His jaw clenched. "I will always come for what is mine." But as his gaze locked onto hers, she saw something deeper. Something he would not say out loud. This was not just about possession. This was about her. Zalika's body ached as she was carried back into the chief's domain, her wrists still raw from the restraints placed on her by Bakery's men. She had been returned like a stolen possession, but something inside her had changed. She had seen what true cruelty looked like. Bakery had treated her as nothing more than a bargaining chip, a mere object in his game against Jabari. Now, as she was placed once more inside the lavish yet suffocating walls of the chief's hut, she realized something unsettling. Though Jabari had taken her unwillingly, he had never treated her with the same level of inhumanity she had just endured. The chief stood before her, his towering form bathed in the dim flickering light of the hut. His sharp gaze was unreadable, but there was something else there, something different. He dismissed the guards with a simple gesture, leaving only the two of them in the silence. "You defied me," Jabari finally said, his voice low, measured. "And yet, you return." Zalika lifted her chin despite the exhaustion in her limbs. "I didn't choose to return." Jabari stepped closer, his presence a force in itself. "And yet, you are here," he murmured. "Do you still believe you have a choice?" Zalika flinched, but not from fear. It was frustration, the realization that no matter how hard she had fought, she was still trapped. "If I had a choice, I would not be here at all." Jabari's jaw tightened. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with something unspoken, something neither of them wanted to admit. "I fought for you," Jabari finally said, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous. "I slaughtered men for you. And yet, you stand before me, still full of defiance." Zalika exhaled shakily. "Did you fight for me, or did you fight because someone dared take something that belonged to you?" A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Jabari's lips, but there was no humor in it. "Does it matter?" Zalika felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had spent so much time resisting, fighting, pushing back, but now the lines were blurred. Jabari had power, undeniable, raw power. He had taken her, claimed her, but he had never forced her into submission. And that was what terrified her the most. "You expect me to surrender to you now?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Jabari took another step forward, until he was close enough for her to feel the heat of his skin. "No," he said, voice thick. "I expect you to understand." Zalika's breath caught. Understand what? That she was no longer just a prisoner? That she had become something else in his eyes? That she had spent so much time trying to escape him, yet she had never truly wanted to run into the arms of another? Jabari's hand lifted, brushing against her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are not weak," he murmured. "I have watched you fight, watched you resist. And I have let you. Because I do not want a woman who submits out of fear." Zalika swallowed hard. The tension between them was electric, dangerous. She knew what would happen if she let herself fall into this moment. If she allowed herself to acknowledge the way her heart pounded not with terror, but with something far more confusing. "I don't belong to you," she whispered. Jabari's gaze darkened. "Then choose," he said, his voice almost a challenge. "Stay because you want to. Or leave now." Zalika stared at him, stunned. Was this another trick? Another way to manipulate her into bending to his will? But as she searched his expression, she saw something different. There was no smugness, no cruel pleasure. Only a raw, waiting intensity. For so long, she had believed she was powerless. But in this moment, she realized she held power, too. The power to decide. The power to change her own fate. And so, she made her choice. The morning light filtered through the slits in the chief's hut, casting golden streaks across the woven walls. Zalika sat by the window, staring out at the village that was now her home. A home she had never wanted, yet one she had claimed as her own. The past weeks had changed everything. No longer just another woman in the chief's domain, she was now the favored one. But it was not the empty favor of possession, it was something deeper, something earned. Jabari, the man who had once seen her as just another acquisition, now looked at her differently. He still carried his dominance, his unshakable authority, but now there was an awareness in his gaze. A respect that had not been there before. She was no longer just a woman trapped in his world. She was part of it, shaping it from within. The other women in the hut had begun to see her differently as well. Where there had once been jealousy and whispers, now there was admiration. Zalika had never wanted power for herself, but she had found a way to use it. She convinced Jabari to allow the women more freedoms, better food, more autonomy in their daily lives. The rigid structure of the chief's household began to soften in places, subtle but undeniable changes that bore her influence. She had even won over the elder women, those who had spent years in silent servitude. With careful words and quiet strength, she gave them voices again. They no longer feared to speak, and the air inside the chief's domain grew lighter, freer. Jabari watched all of this with an amused yet approving gaze. "You are changing things," he remarked one evening, as they sat together under the wide-open sky, the fire between them flickering against the dark. Zalika met his eyes. "I am making things better." He smirked. "Better for them, or better for you?" She tilted her head. "Both." Jabari chuckled, shaking his head. "You are unlike any woman I have known." "You took me," she reminded him. "Did you expect me to be like the others?" His gaze darkened slightly, but it was not with anger. "No. That is why I wanted you." Zalika held his stare, unflinching. Once, his words would have enraged her. Now, they only confirmed what she already knew: she had turned this unwanted fate into something of her own making. But not everyone had accepted this change. Naima, the chief's first wife, had watched her rise with seething hatred. Once, she had been the most powerful woman in the hut, ruling with cruelty and fear. Now, she had been stripped of her influence. Zalika had not needed to scheme against her, her fall had come naturally, as the other women had turned away from her ways and toward Zalika's. But Naima was not one to fade quietly. Late one night, Zalika found herself standing in the shadows of the hut's courtyard, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She turned just in time to see Naima stepping forward, her expression unreadable. "You think you have won," Naima whispered. "But power is never truly given, only taken." Zalika regarded her calmly. "Then take it," she said, voice even. "If you can." Naima's nostrils flared, but she did not move. She had already lost. She knew it, and so did Zalika. The woman who had once tormented her, who had schemed and plotted to rid herself of her, was now nothing more than a ghost of what she had been. Zalika turned and walked away, leaving Naima standing alone in the dark. She had not been broken. She had risen. The day Zalika never thought would come arrived with little warning. Her father stood at the entrance of the chief's compound, his eyes weary, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a struggle he had never won. The moment she saw him, the past rushed back, her simple village life, the smell of the river in the early morning, the warmth of her mother's embrace. For a fleeting moment, she was a child again, untouched by betrayal, power, or passion. "You are free to leave," her father said, his voice trembling with hope and guilt. "The debt is paid. You can come home." The words echoed in her chest like a drumbeat. Come home. The path she had dreamed of for so long stood before her, open and unburdened. All she had to do was step forward. She turned to Jabari, who stood behind her, silent as stone. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. He did not stop her. He did not demand or plead. He simply watched. For the first time since she had been brought to this place, the choice was hers. She looked past him, past the women in the compound who had once pitted her, past the life she had fought against. She saw the changes she had made, the power she had carved out of nothing. She saw herself, not the girl who had been given away, but the woman she had become. "I am not the same," she whispered. Her father reached for her hand, desperate to reclaim the daughter he had lost. "You don't have to be." Zalika's fingers hovered over his, but she did not take them. She turned once more, meeting Jabari's gaze. The man who had taken her, the man she had once hated, the man who had forced her into a world she had never chosen. But he was also the man who had learned to respect her, who had fought for her, who had, in his own way, set her free. She had spent so long fighting, running, refusing. Now, she was standing at the threshold of her old life, and for the first time, she hesitated. She was no longer a girl without power. And power was not something she would give up so easily. With a steady breath, Zalika lifted her chin, turned from the doorway, and stepped back into the chief's world. Her world. The years had transformed Zalika, but not in the way anyone had expected. She no longer walked the compound as the girl who had once been treated like a mere possession. She moved with the grace of a queen, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding. The same women who had once pitted or envied her now bowed their heads in respect. Jabari stood at her side, no longer just her captor, no longer just her husband, but her partner. Where once he had ruled with brute force, now he ruled with wisdom, her wisdom, woven into his decisions, whispered into his ear when no one else was listening. She had not taken his power, she had become a part of it. The land thrived under their rule. The women, once treated as shadows in the chief's court, now had voices that carried in the wind. The men, once driven only by conquest, had learned to value unity. Zalika sat on the throne beside Jabari, watching the village she had once longed to escape. She had fought this place, fought this man, fought fate itself. And yet, fate had not been her enemy, it had been her greatest test. A child ran to her, a boy with sharp eyes and a proud stance. He climbed into her lap, and she smoothed his dark curls. He would never know the fear she once knew. He would never see his mother as weak. She turned to Jabari, and for a moment, they shared a look that needed no words. He had won her once, but now, she had won him in return. Zalika had been given away like a prize, but she had not been conquered. She had become a queen.